She went for a routine blood test, but the lab mixed up her sample with ancient royal lineage markers. The vampire king materialized in the clinic hallway within hours. What no one knew, the pregnancy hormones were already bonding their immortal essences, and he couldn't leave without claiming both mother and child as his eternal court. Elena Vasquez clutched her insurance card with sweaty fingers as she approached the reception desk at Meridian Medical Labs, the fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows across her tired face after another sleepless night spent reviewing research proposals for her new position at the university. The waiting room buzzed with unusual activity for a Tuesday morning, lab technicians wheeling carts loaded with specimens that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Containers marked with symbols she didn't recognize alongside familiar medical labels. She checked her watch twice, anxiety gnawing at her stomach as she considered the stack of employment paperwork waiting on her desk, all contingent on these routine blood tests that stood between her and the research opportunity she'd dreamed about since graduate school. The receptionist, a pale woman with unnaturally sharp canines, barely glanced up as she handed Elena a clipboard thick with forms, muttering something about increased processing times due to special collections. Elena settled into a plastic chair next to a man whose skin seemed to absorb the overhead lighting, and a woman whose reflection appeared strangely distorted in the glass coffee table, both avoiding eye contact in that particular way of people who shared uncomfortable secrets. Dr. Miranda Chen hurried through the laboratory's back corridors, her phone buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from colleagues about the morning's specimen backlog, while technicians juggled vials containing everything from standard lipid panels to samples that required silver-lined containers and protective glyphs. The Supernatural Medical Division operated within Meridian Labs under layers of bureaucratic camouflage, processing genealogy requests for vampire courts alongside human paternity tests, fertility consultations for shapeshifter couples mixed with routine pregnancy screenings, all designed to maintain the careful balance between worlds that most humans never suspected existed. When technician James Morrison reached for Elena's vial, his mind occupied by the complex tracking requirements for a vampire lineage verification request, he grabbed the wrong protocol sheet from his clipboard and fed Elena's sample into the ancient bloodline detection system, a machine that hummed with energies older than the building housing it. The error cascaded through magical detection networks faster than digital data, Elena's ordinary blood triggering alarms designed to identify individuals carrying dormant vampire royal genetics, genetic markers that shouldn't exist in the general human population, but occasionally surfaced in descendants of forgotten supernatural unions. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Elena's blood sample traveled through tubing laced with silver and inscribed with runes, entering chambers where temperature dropped below what normal equipment could achieve. Subjected to analysis that measured not just cellular composition, but the resonance of soul-deep magic that connected bloodlines across centuries. The machine's ancient consciousness, part technology and part supernatural entity, recognized something impossible in Elena's genetic structure and immediately flagged her sample with classifications reserved for the most significant supernatural discoveries, sending automated alerts through networks that connected every major vampire court in North America. Within minutes of the analysis completing, emergency protocols activated throughout the building as Dr. Chen's computer screen filled with warnings about a Category 5 bloodline event, the highest classification reserved for discoveries that could reshape supernatural political structures, while across the city, ancient communication systems carried word to beings who had waited decades for such a signal. Elena left the clinic 45 minutes later with a small bandage on her arm and instructions to expect results within 72 hours, completely unaware that her blood sample had been subjected to analysis protocols developed during the reign of Charlemagne and refined through centuries of supernatural politics. Walking into the afternoon sunshine, with only the faintest sense that something had changed in the quality of light around her. The drive back to her apartment took longer than usual, as she found herself distracted by sounds that seemed sharper than before. The radio's volume causing her to wince while conversations from other cars reached her ears with unusual clarity, and when she stopped at a red light near the university campus, the smell of garlic from a nearby restaurant made her stomach clench with sudden nausea. She attributed the symptoms to stress about her new job and the general anxiety that accompanied major life changes. But as evening approached, she discovered an inexplicable urge to walk toward the old cathedral district, a part of the city she rarely visited, her feet carrying her through narrow streets lined with buildings that predated the Civil War, while shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. The cathedral district hummed with energies Elena couldn't name but felt in her bones, ancient stones that had absorbed centuries of prayers and rituals, both Christian and far older, creating an atmosphere that made her skin tingle with recognition she couldn't explain. She found herself standing before the massive oak doors of St. Bartholomew's Cathedral as darkness settled over the city, drawn by something stronger than curiosity, but unable to articulate why she felt safer here than anywhere else. The Gothic spires reaching toward stars that seemed unusually bright against the urban glow. The sensation of being watched prickled across her shoulders, but when she turned to scan the street behind her, she saw only empty sidewalks and the occasional car passing under streetlights that flickered in patterns too regular to be coincidental, as if responding to her presence with recognition protocols she didn't understand. Dr. Chen stared at her computer screen in growing disbelief as the supernatural analysis results populated her database. Elena's blood work, revealing genetic markers that indicated compatibility with vampire reproduction, at a level seen perhaps once in a generation, combined with hormone readings that suggested pregnancy, despite Elena having no vampire mate and no exposure to the complex ritual requirements necessary for cross-species conception. The implications sent ice through her veins as she realized the magnitude of the laboratory error, a mistake that had not only exposed Elena to supernatural detection systems, but apparently triggered some form of magical pregnancy that defied every law of supernatural biology she understood. She reached for her phone to call the Northern Vampire Court's emergency contact line, knowing that within hours, Elena would become the center of a political storm that could destabilize centuries of carefully maintained, supernatural territorial agreements, while the pregnancy hormones already coursing through Elena's system would inevitably create supernatural bonds with consequences neither species fully comprehended. The temperature in the laboratory dropped 10 degrees as shadows gathered in corners where no shadows should exist, fluorescent bulbs dimming despite steady electrical supply, while equipment registered electromagnetic fluctuations that followed patterns older than recorded history. Demon Ashworth materialized in the main hallway, with the fluid grace of smoke taking solid form, his presence causing automatic doors to malfunction and security cameras to record only static interference, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that seemed to absorb ambient light and reflect none back to observers. His appearance triggered every supernatural ward protecting the building. Alarms only Dr. Chen could hear wailing through frequencies that bypassed human perception, while ancient symbols carved into the foundation stones began glowing with protective energy that had lain dormant for decades. The Vampire King's silver eyes scanned the corridor with predatory focus as he followed the scent trail of his unknown mate, every instinct screaming that she had been here recently and was already carrying his heir, despite the impossibility of such a conception. Chen emerged from her office to find Demon standing motionless in the center of the hallway, his presence commanding enough that maintenance staff unconsciously avoided the area, while patients in nearby waiting rooms felt sudden urges to reschedule their appointments, the air around him crackling with barely contained power that made her half-vampire heritage respond with recognition and fear. She approached carefully, knowing that a territorial vampire king confronted with threats to his mate and offspring represented one of the most dangerous entities in supernatural politics. her medical training warring with survival instincts as she prepared to explain how a simple laboratory error had created a crisis that could spark war between species. Demon's head turned toward her with mechanical precision, his gaze holding intelligence that had accumulated across 8 centuries of existence. And when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, combined with the desperate edge of a male whose protective instincts had been triggered beyond reason. The knock on Elena's apartment door at 11:30 came with the weight of inevitability, though she had no way of knowing that the woman standing in the hallway held her future in a medical tablet, and the man behind her could reshape reality with a thought. Dr. Miranda Chen appeared smaller outside the clinical setting, her black hair pulled back severely, and her dark eyes holding secrets that made Elena's skin crawl with recognition she couldn't name. But it was the figure emerging from the shadows behind Dr. Chen that stole Elena's breath and sent every survival instinct screaming. Demon Ashworth moved like liquid darkness given form, his tall frame draped in a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the hallway's fluorescent light. And when his silver eyes met hers through the door's peephole, Elena felt something fundamental shift in her chest, a recognition that bypassed logic and spoke directly to blood and bone. The Vampire King stepped forward with predatory grace, each movement controlled yet suggesting violence held in careful check, and Elena found herself opening the door despite every rational thought telling her to call security, to run, to do anything but invite these strangers into her sanctuary. Dr. Chen entered first, her medical bag clutched tight, and her expression mixing professional concern with something that looked disturbingly like fear, while Damon filled the doorframe with presence that made Elena's small apartment feel suffocating. The scent that followed him defied description, something between winter air and old stone with an undertone that made her mouth water and her pulse quicken in ways that terrified her. Elena backed toward her kitchen island, fingers gripping the granite edge as Dr. Chen began setting up equipment with practiced efficiency, and Demon remained by the door, his stillness more unsettling than movement would have been, because nothing human could hold that perfect immobility. The explanation came in clinical terms that shattered Elena's world piece by piece. Dr. Chen's voice steady as she described genetic markers and compatibility indexes, while Elena's mind reeled with the impossibility of everything she was hearing. Her rare bloodline carried dormant vampire heritage from generations past, markers that should have remained inactive unless triggered by specific magical processes. But the laboratory's equipment had detected and awakened something that was never meant to surface. The pregnancy wasn't just impossible, it was a biological miracle wrapped in supernatural catastrophe because Elena was carrying the heir to the most powerful vampire court in North America, and the child growing inside her would transform her gradually into something no longer entirely human. Demon spoke for the first time then, his voice carrying accents she couldn't place and authority that made her apartment's walls seem to lean inward, explaining that vampire pregnancies required formal bonding rituals and mutual consent between court-approved mates, not accidental activation through medical equipment designed for genealogical research. What had happened to Elena violated every law of vampire society while simultaneously creating a bond between them that neither could break. A connection that would only strengthen as the pregnancy progressed and her transformation accelerated. Elena laughed then, a sound sharp with hysteria as she gestured around her normal apartment, with its normal furniture and normal life, that was apparently anything but normal, because according to these strangers, she was pregnant with a supernatural heir that would make her immortal whether she wanted it or not. Dr. Chen's tablet showed readings that meant nothing to Elena, but everything to the woman interpreting them. Genetic sequences that proved Elena's body was already changing at the cellular level to accommodate a child that would be born with powers that could reshape the balance between human and vampire worlds. The Vampire King moved closer as Elena's laughter turned to tears, and she felt something electric pass between them when he reached out as if to comfort her before stopping himself, his hand falling to his side while his silver eyes blazed with emotions she couldn't interpret but could feel echoing in her own chest. The bond was real, she realized with growing terror, because when Demon's jaw clenched with frustration, she felt the phantom ache in her own teeth, and when her heart raced with panic, she saw his nostrils flare, as if he could taste her fear on the air. Dr. Chen packed her equipment with quick movements while explaining that Elena had perhaps 3 weeks before the transformation became obvious to any supernatural being who encountered her, which meant 3 weeks before every vampire faction in the country would know exactly where to find the future heir to the Northern Court. The child would be born with unprecedented power, according to ancient prophecies, abilities that could bridge human and vampire societies or destroy both depending on who controlled its upbringing and political allegiances. Elena sank onto her couch as the full scope of her situation crashed over her. Because she wasn't just accidentally pregnant, she was carrying the future of supernatural politics in her womb, while bonded to a vampire king who looked at her like she was both salvation and catastrophe wrapped in human skin. Demon knelt before her then, moving with fluid grace that proved he wasn't bound by human limitations of joint and muscle. And when he spoke, his voice carried centuries of authority, tempered by something that might have been genuine concern for her well-being rather than just the child she carried. The transformation would protect both her and the baby, he explained, but it couldn't be reversed once begun, which meant Elena had to choose between becoming immortal or losing everything that made the pregnancy possible in the first place. The apartment fell silent except for the hum of Elena's refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic, normal life continuing outside, while inside her world shifted on its axis towards something she couldn't comprehend. Dr. Chen gathered her courage and spoke the final piece of information that changed everything, explaining that the pregnancy had created a supernatural bond between Elena and Demon that would intensify over time, connecting their emotions and eventually their thoughts until they could no more be separated than shadow from substance. Elena looked into Demon's silver eyes and felt the truth of it resonating in her bones, the certainty that her life as she knew it was over, whether she accepted this reality or spent her remaining weeks in denial. The Vampire King rose slowly, his movements carrying regret and determination in equal measure, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of absolute truth, that she was under his protection now whether she wanted it or not, because the air she carried made her the most valuable and vulnerable person in the supernatural world. Elena closed her eyes and felt the future rushing toward her like a freight train, knowing that when she opened them again, she would have to choose between fighting the impossible or surrendering to a destiny she never asked for but couldn't escape. Elena's hands pressed against the cold stone walls as Demon guided her through passages that seemed to pulse with ancient energy. The Vampire King moved with fluid grace through corridors carved from living rock, his fingers trailing along symbols that glowed silver at his touch. She could smell centuries of incense and something metallic that made her newly heightened senses recoil. The narrow tunnel opened suddenly into a vast chamber that stole her breath completely. Crystalline formations jutted from walls that soared beyond the reach of torchlight, while veins of luminescent metal threaded through the stone like frozen lightning. Technology she couldn't begin to understand hummed quietly in alcoves, devices that appeared to be grown rather than built, their surfaces shifting between organic curves and geometric precision. The Vampire King gestured toward a platform where robed figures waited, their faces hidden but their power unmistakable. Elena felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure against her skin. This was no medieval court lurking in shadows, but a civilization that had evolved parallel to humanity for millennia, their achievements hidden behind carefully maintained illusions. Demon's voice carried new formality as he spoke to the assembled court in a language that sounded like music played on crystal chimes. Elena understood nothing, but felt meaning flowing directly into her mind, the supernatural bond translating concepts too complex for human words. The pregnancy had awakened more than protective instincts in the vampire king, she realized with growing unease. Something fundamental had changed between them that went beyond the medical accident that started this nightmare. The robed figures parted to reveal an ancient woman whose skin seemed translucent in the strange light. The oracle's eyes held depths that suggested she had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, her gaze stripping away pretense to examine Elena's very essence. When the old woman spoke, her words resonated through the chamber with authority that made the crystals sing in harmony. The revelation hit Elena like cold water flooding her lungs. This was not random chance but destiny calling in a debt written into her very DNA. Somewhere in her ancestry lay vampire blood diluted by generations, but never truly gone, waiting for the right catalyst to awaken. The laboratory equipment had done more than detect these markers. It had activated dormant genetic sequences that transformed her into something unprecedented. The oracle's examination revealed truths that terrified everyone present. Elena carried the bloodline of Seraphina Blackthorn, a hybrid born in the 15th century who could walk in sunlight while commanding the full spectrum of vampire abilities. Seraphina had been hunted to extinction by both human witch hunters and vampire purists who feared what her existence represented. Her descendants had hidden among humans for 500 years, their supernatural heritage buried so deep that even they remained unaware of their potential. Elena was not just any human who happened to conceive a vampire heir, but the last living descendant of a bloodline that both species had tried to destroy. The child growing inside her would inherit abilities that made traditional vampires seem limited by comparison. While ancient vampires burned in direct sunlight and youngest ones merely weakened, her child would thrive in daylight hours without losing any nocturnal advantages. The implications sent shockwaves through supernatural politics that had remained stable for centuries. Every vampire faction would seek to control this child or eliminate it before the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Demon's expression transformed as he absorbed the oracle's words, his casual confidence replaced by something approaching reverence, mixed with terror. The vampire king had ruled through strength and political cunning for 8 centuries, but this child would be born with power that dwarfed his own achievements. Elena felt his internal struggle through their bond, as he wrestled with the reality that his heir would eventually surpass him in ways that challenged every assumption about vampire hierarchy. The oracle continued her examination with instruments that defied explanation. Devices that seemed to read genetic memories embedded in Elena's cells. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of what the child would become and why every supernatural faction had reason to fear its existence. Vampires had maintained their secret civilization by accepting certain limitations, chief among them, their vulnerability to sunlight and their dependence on human blood for survival. A hybrid who could operate freely in both worlds while possessing enhanced versions of traditional vampire abilities would upset the careful balance that kept their species hidden from human detection. Elena's scientific training helped her process the implications even as her emotional mind reeled from the scope of what she had stumbled into. The child would not just be powerful, but would represent evolutionary advancement that threatened established order in ways that went beyond politics into the realm of species survival. Traditional vampires might find themselves obsolete within a few generations if hybrid bloodlines proved more adaptable to the modern world. The oracle's final pronouncement carried the weight of prophecy that had guided supernatural politics for 1,000 years. This child would either unite the vampire courts under a new form of leadership or trigger a war that would expose their existence to humanity before either species was prepared for such revelation. Elena's role was no longer that of an accidental mother, but as the bearer of a being that would reshape supernatural society, whether she chose to participate in that transformation or not. Demon's protective instincts had evolved beyond personal attachment into recognition that Elena and the child represented the future of his entire species. The Vampire King's court would need to prepare for challenges that traditional political structures could not address, while Elena would need to master abilities she was only beginning to understand. The ancient woman's examination concluded with warnings that chilled everyone present, despite the chamber's supernatural warmth. Other bloodlines existed in dormancy around the world, their carriers living normal human lives while genetic time bombs waited for activation. Elena's pregnancy would trigger supernatural detection systems that might awaken other dormant hybrids prematurely, creating a cascade of evolutionary pressure that could destabilize both human and vampire societies. The oracle spoke of signs already manifesting across continents as ancient bloodlines stirred in response to Elena's transformation. The Vampire King faced a choice that would define his legacy for centuries to come. He could attempt to suppress knowledge of Elena's true heritage and raise the child in isolation, hoping to prevent the prophecy from fulfilling itself. Alternatively, he could embrace the coming changes and position his court as the bridge between old traditions and evolutionary necessity. Either path carried risks that could destroy everything he had built over 8 centuries of careful rule. Elena listened to the discussions swirling around her while processing the reality that her child would never have the option of a normal life. The pregnancy had transformed her from human to something unprecedented. But the child would be born into a role that came with responsibilities neither of them had chosen. The oracle's words painted a future where supernatural secrecy might become impossible to maintain, forcing both species to confront their relationship with each other in ways they had avoided for millennia. The chamber fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of what had been revealed, the only sound the crystalline resonance that seemed to carry their thoughts into the stone itself. Elena felt the Vampire King's mind touching hers through their bond, sharing fears and hopes that he could voice to no one else. The pregnancy that had begun as a laboratory mistake had revealed itself as the culmination of a supernatural legacy that stretched back 5 centuries, with implications that would echo for centuries to come. The ornate invitation arrived at dawn, delivered by a raven whose eyes held too much intelligence for any natural bird, the parchment bearing seals that made Elena's transformed blood sing with recognition she wished she could ignore. Isabella Cross had formally invoked the right of contested claim, an ancient law that predated written vampire history and gave rival courts the authority to challenge unmarked bonds when they involved heirs of political significance. The elegant script detailed proceedings that would convene within the week, requiring Elena's presence before a tribunal of vampire lords whose combined age exceeded recorded human civilization. Demon's reaction to the challenge sent tremors through the stronghold's stone foundations, his fury manifesting as shadows that writhed independently of their sources, while temperature dropped enough to frost windows throughout the complex. The Vampire King explained through gritted teeth that Isabella's move was politically brilliant and legally unassailable because Elena bore no formal mate marks, and their bond remained unwitnessed by the courts that governed vampire society. The Southern Court's queen could argue that Elena's pregnancy resulted from accident rather than legitimate courtship, making the child's custody a matter for political arbitration rather than parental rights. Elena felt her newly awakened abilities responding to the stress, her enhanced senses picking up conversations throughout the stronghold as vampires prepared for what could become either diplomatic triumph or the beginning of a war that would shatter centuries of careful peace between the courts. Dr. Chen arrived within hours of the challenge's delivery, her medical bag replaced by legal texts that appeared to be bound in materials Elena preferred not to examine too closely. The revelation that their unlikely ally possessed half-vampire heritage explained her unusual knowledge of supernatural medicine, but also added layers of complexity to Elena's situation as she realized how many people around her operated with divided loyalties between human and vampire worlds. The doctor's offer to serve as Elena's legal advocate came with warnings about the formal court proceedings that would determine not just custody of the unborn child, but Elena's own fate within vampire society. The laws governing such contests had been written when vampire females were considered property, and heirs belonged to whichever court could demonstrate superior political standing, protocols that made Elena's modern sensibilities rebel, even as her ancestral memories whispered strategies for navigating the coming ordeal. As Elena studied the legal precedents that would govern her case, her abilities manifested in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Text written in languages she had never learned became suddenly comprehensible, as if her vampire heritage was downloading centuries of accumulated knowledge directly into her consciousness. When Demon attempted to demonstrate proper courtly behavior, Elena found herself reading his intentions before he spoke them, accessing thoughts and emotions through their bond with increasing clarity that both thrilled and terrified her. The transformation was accelerating beyond Dr. Chen's medical projections, Elena's human limitations dissolving as supernatural capabilities emerged in unpredictable bursts that left her feeling like a stranger in her own body. During one particularly intense training session, Elena's frustration with arcane legal terminology triggered an emotional projection that sent every vampire in the stronghold into temporary euphoria, demonstrating power that made even demons step back with newfound wariness. The political implications of her evolving abilities became clear as Dr. Chen explained that vampires of Elena's apparent strength typically required centuries to develop such skills, yet she was manifesting advanced powers within weeks of her initial transformation. The unborn child was apparently accelerating Elena's development in ways that defied every law of vampire physiology, creating a feedback loop that enhanced both mother and offspring beyond theoretical limits. Isabella Cross would undoubtedly use Elena's rapid advancement as evidence that she represented a dangerous unknown that threatened the stability of established vampire society. The neutral territory chosen for the court assembly lay beneath Manhattan in caverns that predated human settlement. Carved from living rock by powers that modern vampires could barely comprehend, and expanded over millennia into a subterranean palace worthy of the proceedings it would host. Elena descended through passages lined with crystalline formations that pulsed with their own inner light, each step taking her deeper into a world that operated by rules she was only beginning to understand. The assembled vampire lords represented political power that spanned continents and centuries, their combined presence creating an atmosphere charged with supernatural energy that made Elena's skin crawl with recognition patterns embedded in her awakening genetic memories. Isabella Cross commanded the Southern Court's delegation with regal authority that made Elena understand why she posed such a significant threat to Demon's position. Her beauty enhanced by vampiric perfection, but her eyes holding calculation that spoke of political acumen sharpened over multiple human lifetimes. The formal challenge began with protocols that seemed designed more to intimidate than inform, ancient languages flowing between speakers, while Elena relied increasingly on ancestral memories that surfaced without warning to guide her responses. As the proceedings continued, Elena found herself accessing knowledge that belonged to Seraphina Blackthorn and her other vampire ancestors, their experiences bleeding through the genetic barriers that had kept their heritage dormant for centuries. Combat techniques flowed into her muscle memory, while political strategies crystallized in her mind, the accumulated wisdom of her bloodline manifesting as Elena faced challenges that would have overwhelmed any normal human. Isabella's arguments proved as elegant as they were devastating, painting Elena as an uncontrolled variable whose hybrid nature threatened to destabilize the careful balance that kept vampire society hidden from human detection. The Southern Court's queen spoke eloquently of the dangers posed by daywalking vampires and the precedent that Elena's child would set for future generations, her words carrying enough truth to make several neutral lords nod in apparent agreement. But when Elena rose to respond, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through the ancient chamber with authority that surprised everyone present, including herself. The power of her bloodline manifesting as she defended not just her right to raise her child, but the evolutionary necessity that her pregnancy represented. The debate raged for hours, while Elena felt her abilities growing stronger under pressure. Her bond with Demon providing emotional anchor points that kept her centered as supernatural energies coursed through her transforming body. During a particularly heated exchange about the child's future loyalties, Elena's enhanced senses detected movement in the upper galleries where no movement should exist, her vampire heritage recognizing threats that her human training couldn't have identified. The assassination attempt came not from rival vampires, but from human operatives whose equipment suggested military backing and whose presence in the neutral territory violated treaties that had maintained peace between species for generations. Elena moved with speed that surprised her as bullets filled the air where she had been standing, her body responding to danger with reflexes that belonged to her vampire ancestors, while her mind processed the implications of human forces discovering their most sacred gathering place. Demon's response to the attack revealed why he had ruled the Northern Court for 8 centuries, his fury manifesting as lethal grace that turned armed operatives into cautionary examples while his court rallied to protect their queen and heir from unprecedented external threat. The human attackers carried technology specifically designed to harm vampires, weapons that shouldn't have existed outside of theoretical military research programs, suggesting that government agencies had not only discovered vampire society, but had been preparing for conflict with supernatural forces. Isabella Cross found herself fighting beside Demon against the common threat, their political differences temporarily set aside as both courts recognized that human military intervention represented an existential danger to vampire civilization. Elena's transformation accelerated dramatically under combat stress, her abilities manifesting in ways that turned her from protected asset to active participant in the battle as she demonstrated strength and speed that impressed even veteran vampire warriors. Marcus Reed's phone call came at the worst possible moment, his voice tight with controlled desperation as he explained that his human family had vanished from their safe house, along with evidence suggesting government involvement in their disappearance. The loyal advisor's anguish bled through his professional composure as he described the ultimatum that forced him to choose between his sworn duty to Demon and the lives of his wife and children. Elena felt the Vampire King's rage through their bond as he absorbed the reality of betrayal from one of his most trusted allies, understanding that Marcus faced an impossible choice between personal loyalty and family survival. The intelligence that Marcus provided under duress revealed how thoroughly human agencies had penetrated vampire security, their knowledge of stronghold locations and protective protocols suggesting surveillance operations that had been running for years without detection. Government forces had not stumbled onto vampire society by accident, but had been systematically mapping supernatural networks while developing weapons and strategies specifically designed for warfare against beings whose existence they were not supposed to acknowledge. Elena's pregnancy had apparently triggered government interest, not because it represented a supernatural anomaly, but because it confirmed theories about hybrid bloodlines that human researchers had been pursuing for decades. The realization that both human and vampire societies had been keeping secrets from each other about the extent of their mutual knowledge added layers of complexity to Elena's situation that made traditional court politics seem simple by comparison. As government forces surrounded the stronghold using technology that bypassed vampire detection systems, Elena felt her bond with Demon evolving from supernatural compulsion into genuine emotional connection forged through shared danger and mutual dependence. Their artificial beginning had given way to something real and powerful, love that transcended the magical forces that originally brought them together, but was complicated by the circumstances that made choice and consent retroactively impossible to determine. Isabella Cross's final legal gambit arrived simultaneously with intelligence reports about human military deployment, her petition to the assembled courts asking them to strip Demon of his throne on grounds that his failure to protect vampire secrecy endangered their entire civilization. The Southern Court's queen argued that Elena's pregnancy and the government response it had triggered proved that hybrid bloodlines posed too great a risk to vampire survival, making the coming child a threat that superseded any political considerations about parental rights or court jurisdiction. Elena stood beside Demon as both supernatural and human forces converged on their location, her transformed abilities finally stabilizing into something she could control and direct as she prepared to fight for a future that neither species seemed willing to allow her to choose. The first explosion shattered the cathedral's ancient windows as government forces breached the outer defenses with weapons that screamed through frequencies designed to disorient vampire senses. Their assault coordinated with military precision that suggested months of planning and preparation. Elena felt the shock waves through the stronghold's foundations as she pressed herself against the cold stone walls of the sacred chamber. Her pregnancy now so advanced that every movement required careful consideration, while her hybrid abilities surged unpredictably in response to the surrounding chaos. Demon's voice echoed through the corridors as he rallied the court's defenders, his ancient authority commanding absolute loyalty from vampires who had never faced human military technology specifically engineered to neutralize their supernatural advantages. The weapons piercing the stronghold's defenses emitted electromagnetic pulses that interfered with vampire reflexes while projecting ultraviolet radiation intense enough to cause actual burns rather than mere discomfort, forcing the defenders to adapt their centuries-old combat techniques to threats they had never encountered. Elena's enhanced hearing picked up radio chatter from the attacking forces as they reported on structural weaknesses in the cathedral's defenses, their knowledge of the building's layout suggesting surveillance operations that had been monitoring vampire activities for far longer than anyone had suspected. Dr. Chen worked frantically over medical equipment that hummed with power drawn from the cathedral's mystical wards, her half-vampire heritage allowing her to maintain the delicate systems that monitored Elena's rapidly progressing labor, while explosions sent tremors through the chamber's protective barriers. The sacred space pulsed with energies accumulated over centuries of vampire rituals, ancient protections that held against modern weapons, but showed signs of strain as the government forces pressed their assault with relentless determination. Elena felt her transformation reaching its final stages as the unborn child's power interfaced with her own developing abilities. Their combined supernatural signature, creating resonances that strengthened the cathedral's defensive wards while simultaneously marking their location for anyone with the proper detection equipment. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very powers meant to protect her and the baby also served as a beacon that guided their enemies directly to their sanctuary. Through her bond with Damon, Elena experienced fragments of the battle raging in the upper levels as vampire defenders used speed and strength against human opponents who compensated for physical disadvantages with superior technology and tactical coordination. The Vampire King fought with lethal efficiency born of 8 centuries of combat experience. But even he struggled against weapons that anticipated vampire abilities and countered them with scientific precision that turned supernatural advantages into potential vulnerabilities. The sacred chamber's ancient stones began to crack as the intensity of the assault increased, electromagnetic pulses disrupting the mystical energies that maintained the stronghold's defensive systems, while projectiles designed to penetrate supernatural barriers found their marks with increasing frequency. Dr. Chen's equipment registered dangerous fluctuations in Elena's vital signs as the stress of battle triggered contractions that announced the child's imminent arrival. The medical readings showing supernatural developments that exceeded every theoretical projection about hybrid pregnancies. Elena felt her body preparing for birth, while her consciousness expanded to encompass awareness that stretched throughout the cathedral's vast structure, her enhanced senses tracking every defender and attacker as the battle reached critical intensity. The transformation process that had begun weeks ago completed itself in moments as Elena's human limitations dissolved entirely, replaced by abilities that dwarfed those of traditional vampires while retaining aspects of her original nature that made her something genuinely unprecedented in supernatural history. Dr. Chen called out warnings about complications in the pregnancy that required immediate medical intervention, but her words were cut short as an electromagnetic pulse overloaded the protective systems and sent feedback through equipment that had been designed to interface with supernatural physiology rather than withstand military-grade electronic warfare. The doctor's sacrifice came not as a dramatic gesture, but as a calculated decision to maintain the medical support Elena needed during the most dangerous phase of her transformation, her half-vampire constitution, allowing her to channel lethal amounts of mystical energy through her own body to keep the life support systems functioning, even as the effort consumed her life force. Elena felt Dr. Chen's death through supernatural senses that suddenly expanded beyond anything she had experienced before. The loss triggering an emotional response that manifested as protective barriers around the sacred chamber strong enough to deflect the most sophisticated weapons the government forces could deploy against them. The grief and rage flowing through her hybrid nature created resonances in the cathedral's ancient stones that awakened defensive systems older than vampire civilization, protections that had been dormant for millennia, until Elena's unique nature provided the key to their activation. Isabella Cross chose her moment with political cunning that demonstrated why she had ruled the Southern Court for over 4 centuries, using the chaos of the government assault to invoke the formal challenge protocols that vampire law recognized even during active warfare. The Southern Court's queen materialized in the sacred chamber with supernatural grace that seemed unmarked by the battle raging around them, her appearance immaculate despite the destruction occurring throughout the stronghold, as she demanded satisfaction of her legal right to contest Elena's claim to the heir. The challenge came at the worst possible moment, as Elena felt contractions intensifying, while explosions sent debris raining down from the chamber's vaulted ceiling, forcing her to choose between accepting Isabella's challenge personally or allowing others to fight for her child's future while she remained a passive observer. Elena's decision to face the Southern Court's queen directly marked the moment when she fully embraced her role within vampire society, rising from her protective position against the chamber wall with fluid grace that demonstrated how completely her transformation had progressed during the stress of battle. Isabella moved with predatory elegance as she circled Elena in the ancient ritual patterns that governed formal challenges, her beauty enhanced by vampiric perfection, but her movements betraying the desperation of someone fighting not just for political advantage but for survival itself. The confrontation revealed Isabella's true motivation as her carefully maintained facade cracked under pressure, exposing the decay that had been consuming her for decades as an unidentified supernatural plague slowly destroyed her immortal constitution from within. The Southern Court's queen believed that consuming hybrid blood from Elena's child would provide the regenerative power necessary to halt her deterioration and restore the immortality that had sustained her for centuries, making this challenge about much more than political control over a potential heir. Elena's refusal to sacrifice her unborn child for any political consideration, even to save Isabella's life, established her as a legitimate leader whose priorities transcended the traditional power structures that had governed vampire society for millennia. The formal challenge devolved into a battle between desperation and determination as Isabella's weakened state forced her to rely on centuries of accumulated skill rather than raw supernatural power, while Elena fought with abilities so recently awakened that she had to learn their limits through trial and potentially fatal error. The final confrontation began as Elena felt her body preparing for birth, while Isabella pressed her attack with increasing fury, the Southern Court's queen recognizing that her window of opportunity was rapidly closing as Elena's hybrid nature reached its full potential. Demon's presence filled Elena's awareness through their bond, as the vampire king abandoned his coordination of the stronghold's defense to protect his mate and child during the most vulnerable moments of the birth process. His decision to prioritize family over tactical considerations, marking a fundamental shift in his priorities as a ruler. The sacred chamber's ancient energies responded to Elena's labor as if the birth of her hybrid child represented a mystical event the cathedral had been designed to witness. Protective wards strengthening dramatically as the baby's unique supernatural signature interfaced with power sources that predated human civilization. Isabella's assault faltered as the birth energy disrupted her already compromised abilities, while simultaneously affecting the government forces whose technological weapons began malfunctioning in response to supernatural emanations they had not been designed to accommodate. Elena felt the child moving into position for birth, while her consciousness expanded to encompass awareness of every life force within the cathedral's boundaries. Her hybrid nature, allowing her to perceive the fundamental difference between human and vampire life signatures, while recognizing something entirely new in the being she was about to bring into the world. The child emerged with silver eyes that held intelligence beyond any newborn's capacity, an aura of power that affected both species in ways that forced friend and enemy alike to recognize the birth of something genuinely unprecedented in the history of human-vampire relations. Isabella's desperate lunge toward the newborn met with defensive reactions that manifested without Elena's conscious control, her maternal instincts triggering supernatural attacks that sent the Southern Court's queen reeling backward with injuries that her weakened constitution couldn't heal. The child's natural defenses proved too powerful for Isabella's deteriorated state to overcome. Supernatural barriers emanating from the infant that protected it from any attempt to drain its hybrid blood, while Elena's protective fury manifested as devastating force that established clear boundaries around her family. The birth energy cascaded through the cathedral's structure in waves that disrupted every technological and supernatural system within miles, creating a momentary ceasefire as both sides struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed, while recognizing that the balance of power between species had shifted irrevocably with the arrival of Elena's unprecedented child. The electromagnetic pulse that had disabled government weapons continued to ripple through electronic systems across the city as Elena cradled her newborn child in the cathedral's sacred chamber, the infant's silver eyes reflecting light that seemed to come from within, rather than from external sources. The child's aura pulsed gently with power that made ancient stones hum in harmony, while disrupted military equipment sparked and died throughout the stronghold, creating an eerie silence that followed the chaos of battle. Government forces retreated in confusion as their sophisticated anti-vampire technology proved useless against supernatural emanations they had never encountered before. Their commanders struggling to explain how a newborn infant had neutralized millions of dollars worth of specialized military hardware with nothing more than its natural presence. Elena felt her consciousness expanding as her transformation completed itself, her hybrid nature stabilizing into something that retained human empathy while encompassing vampire abilities that exceeded anything documented in supernatural medical literature. The bond with Demon had evolved beyond the artificial compulsion that originally brought them together, their connection now flowing both ways as genuine partnership rather than supernatural dependency, each maintaining individual identity while sharing thoughts and emotions that enriched rather than overwhelmed their separate personalities. Isabella Cross lay unconscious against the chamber's far wall, her weakened constitution unable to recover from Elena's defensive attack, but alive and slowly healing as the supernatural plague that had been consuming her began responding to proximity to the hybrid child's unprecedented life force. The immediate crisis had passed, but Elena recognized that everything had changed in ways that would reshape both human and vampire societies, their secret coexistence now impossible to maintain after government forces had openly attacked a supernatural stronghold in the heart of New York City. The days following the birth brought delegations from vampire courts across the globe as word spread about the child whose very existence challenged every assumption about the limitations that defined vampire society. Representatives arriving through supernatural travel methods that bypassed human detection, while international intelligence agencies struggled to explain the electromagnetic anomalies that had disrupted communications throughout the northeastern United States. Elena found herself at the center of negotiations between species that had maintained careful separation for millennia. Her unique position as a human-turned hybrid, making her the ideal bridge between worlds that could no longer pretend the other didn't exist. Government officials arrived under flags of diplomatic immunity, their previous hostility replaced by recognition that supernatural beings represented a political reality that required accommodation rather than elimination, especially when those beings possessed abilities that could neutralize advanced military technology with apparent ease. Demon's Court underwent fundamental restructuring as ancient hierarchies adapted to include Elena not as a conquered mate, but as a partner whose human perspective and scientific training proved invaluable in navigating the complex political landscape that emerged from forced revelation of vampire society. The Vampire King found himself ruling alongside someone whose mortal origins provided insights into human psychology and social structures that centuries of supernatural isolation had made foreign to traditional vampire leadership. Their combined authority creating a new model for supernatural governance that other courts began adopting. Elena's scientific background became an asset rather than an obstacle as she helped modernize vampire approaches to managing their relationship with humanity. Her research experience allowing her to design protocols for supernatural human interaction that protected both species while acknowledging the reality of their interdependence. The child's development exceeded every projection as it demonstrated intelligence and abilities that suggested hybrid nature created not just enhanced vampires, but an entirely new form of supernatural being with capabilities that neither parent species possessed independently. 3 months after the birth, Elena had adapted to immortal life while maintaining the curiosity and empathy that had defined her human existence, her scientific training helping her understand the physiological changes that had transformed her from mortal researcher to hybrid being with abilities that continued evolving as her supernatural nature stabilized. The child showed remarkable development that fascinated both vampire scholars and human scientists who had been granted limited access to study hybrid physiology under carefully controlled conditions, its intelligence and supernatural abilities manifesting in ways that suggested genetic potential far beyond what either parent species could achieve alone. Elena stood in the modernized medical facility that had been established within the vampire stronghold, her role shifting from patient to advocate as she worked to establish healthcare protocols that served both supernatural and human populations, the irony not lost on her that she had returned to a medical setting but now held the power to shape rather than simply endure the experience. Demon watched their child demonstrate abilities that already exceeded his own in some areas, the Vampire King adapting to parenthood with the same strategic thinking that had guided his rule for 8 centuries, while recognizing that traditional approaches to vampire education would prove inadequate for a being whose nature transcended established categories. The relationship between Elena and Damon had matured into genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared responsibility rather than supernatural compulsion, their bond allowing intimate communication without sacrificing individual autonomy as they navigated the challenges of ruling a court that bridged two species. Elena's human connections remained strong, despite her transformation, her relationships with former colleagues evolving as she helped establish research programs that studied supernatural physiology while protecting both communities from exploitation or discrimination that could arise from fear or misunderstanding. The message arrived through supernatural channels that bypassed conventional communication networks, its contents suggesting that Elena's experience represented part of a larger pattern of supernatural evolution occurring worldwide, rather than an isolated incident that had accidentally triggered species-wide revelation. Intelligence reports from vampire courts across continents described similar births of hybrid children whose abilities defied traditional classifications, suggesting that dormant bloodlines were awakening simultaneously in response to environmental or supernatural pressures that remained poorly understood. Elena felt responsibility settling on her shoulders as she realized that other women might be experiencing transformations similar to her own, without benefit of the support systems that had helped her survive the process. Their children potentially vulnerable to the same political and military threats that had nearly destroyed her family. The broader implications of widespread hybrid births painted a picture of supernatural evolution that could either unite the species through shared destiny or trigger conflicts that would expose both communities to existential threats they were unprepared to face. Demon's intelligence network provided fragmentary reports about government programs in multiple countries that had been monitoring supernatural populations for decades, suggesting that the attack on their stronghold represented coordinated international effort rather than isolated military operation, making protection of emerging hybrid families a matter of global security rather than local politics. Elena's decision to locate and protect other hybrid children crystallized as she recognized that her unique position as a successfully transformed hybrid gave her both the authority and responsibility to guide others through the dangerous process of awakening supernatural heritage that had remained dormant for generations. The scientific aspects of hybrid development fascinated Elena, even as the political implications terrified her. The possibility that her child represented the first of a new species that would eventually replace both humans and traditional vampires, adding urgency to establishing stable relationships between communities that had coexisted in secret for millennia. The establishment of the new order required careful negotiation between vampire courts, human governments, and the emerging hybrid population that threatened to upset the balance of power between species that had remained stable for centuries. Elena's role as mediator, proving crucial as her transformation story, provided a template for managing similar cases that would inevitably arise as more dormant bloodlines activated. Her scientific training allowed her to propose research protocols that satisfied human curiosity about supernatural physiology while protecting vampire society from exploitation or exposure that could trigger panic or persecution from human populations unprepared for such revelations. The child's presence at diplomatic meetings had unexpected effects, as its hybrid nature seemed to calm tensions between species representatives, its aura somehow promoting cooperation rather than competition in ways that suggested supernatural abilities extending beyond traditional vampire powers into realms of emotional and psychological influence that could prove crucial for maintaining peace. Elena found herself designing educational programs that would help both communities understand the implications of supernatural revelation, while preparing for a future where secrecy was no longer possible and cooperation became necessary for mutual survival. The vampire courts began adapting their ancient traditions to accommodate hybrid members whose nature challenged fundamental assumptions about vampire society, while human institutions struggled to develop policies for interacting with beings whose abilities exceeded normal parameters, but whose rights deserved protection under evolving international law. Demon's support for Elena's initiatives demonstrated how their partnership had transformed not just their personal relationship, but his approach to leadership. The ancient vampire king, learning to value perspectives that his centuries of experience had never provided, while adapting his court's traditions to embrace change rather than resist it. The final image of Elena holding their child while discussing plans for locating other hybrid families suggested that her journey from accidental pregnancy to supernatural leadership represented only the beginning of a larger story about evolution, cooperation, and the courage required to embrace change that promised to reshape both species in ways they were only beginning to understand. The love that had grown between her and Demon, providing the foundation for a future neither could have imagined when a simple laboratory error first brought them together.